In the autumn of 1875, the small town of Harrodsburg, Kentucky, stood as a quiet testament to post-war America, where cobblestone streets echoed with the clip-clop of horse hooves and gas lamps flickered against the encroaching darkness each evening. Among the respectable citizens of this modest community lived Dr. Cornelius Blackwell, a physician whose reputation had once been sterling, a man whose hands were said to heal the sick and comfort the dying. His practice occupied a stately brick building on Main Street, where townsfolk would gather in the waiting room, exchanging pleasantries and gossip while awaiting their turn to see the good doctor. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, behind the polished mahogany doors and velvet curtains of the Blackwell residence, something far more sinister was taking root, something that would challenge the very boundaries of medical ethics and paternal duty. The doctor had become obsessed with a new scientific movement sweeping through academic circles, a movement that promised to perfect humanity itself through careful selection and controlled breeding, a philosophy that would later be known as eugenics. Dr. Blackwell had not always been a man consumed by such radical ideas. In his youth, he had been a devoted student of medicine, graduating with honors from the University of Pennsylvania, where he studied under some of the most brilliant minds of his generation. He returned to Kentucky with dreams of serving his community, of bringing modern medical knowledge to the rural heartland, and for many years he did exactly that. He married a gentlewoman named Eleanor, the daughter of a local merchant, and together they had 3 children, 2 sons who would eventually leave home to pursue their own fortunes, and a daughter named Abigail, born in 1860, who would become the unwitting subject of her father's descent into madness. Eleanor had passed away from consumption in 1872, leaving Cornelius alone with 15-year-old Abigail, and it was in this period of grief and isolation that the doctor's mind began to turn toward darker pursuits. He started receiving journals and pamphlets from colleagues in Boston and New York, publications that spoke of hereditary improvement, of breeding out weakness and disease, of creating a superior race through scientific intervention. The transformation was gradual at first, barely noticeable to the outside world. Dr. Blackwell began spending more time in his private study, poring over texts by Francis Galton and other early proponents of hereditary science. He filled notebooks with measurements, charts, and calculations, attempting to quantify human worth through skull dimensions, facial angles, and physical proportions. His medical practice continued as before, but his colleagues began to notice a strange intensity in his eyes, a fervor when he spoke of inherited traits and biological destiny. He started making unusual requests of his patients, asking to measure their children, to document family histories of illness and deformity, to provide detailed accounts of their ancestry. Most complied, trusting in the doctor's expertise, believing these inquiries were part of some new diagnostic technique. None suspected that Dr. Blackwell was constructing an elaborate theory, one that would require empirical proof, one that would demand a test subject close at hand, one who could not refuse or escape his experimental designs. Abigail Blackwell was a bright and curious girl, with her mother's gentle disposition and her father's keen intellect. She had been educated at home, as was proper for young ladies of her station, learning literature, music, and the domestic arts. After her mother's death, she had taken on the responsibilities of managing the household, overseeing the cook and the maid, ensuring that her father's home remained a place of order and comfort. She loved her father deeply, respected his work, and took pride in his standing within the community. She could not have known that in his grief-stricken mind she had become something else entirely, not a daughter to be cherished and protected, but a specimen to be studied, a canvas upon which he could paint his theories in blood and suffering. The first signs of trouble came in small ways, requests that seemed odd but not alarming. Her father asking to measure her height and weight with unusual frequency, examining her teeth and eyes with instruments typically reserved for his patients, recording observations in leather-bound journals that he kept locked in his desk. If you find yourself drawn into this dark tale of scientific obsession and familial betrayal, subscribe to Mysteries Beneath the Veil, where we uncover the hidden horrors that history tried to forget. By the winter of 1875, Dr. Blackwell had convinced himself that his daughter represented an opportunity for groundbreaking research, a chance to test his theories about inherited characteristics and the malleability of human biology. He began to see her not as Abigail, the child who had sat on his knee and called him Papa, but as Subject 1, the first in what he imagined would be a series of experiments that would revolutionize medical science and secure his place in history. He rationalized his plans with the cold logic of a man who had lost touch with his own humanity, telling himself that any discomfort she might experience would be temporary, that the knowledge gained would benefit countless future generations, that sacrifice in the name of progress was not only justified but necessary. The stage was set for a horror that would unfold within the walls of a respectable home, hidden from the eyes of neighbors and friends, a crime that would only come to light through the courage of one young woman and the persistence of those who refused to look away from evil. The experiments began in January of 1876, though Abigail did not recognize them as such at first. Her father had always been a man of science, and his interest in measurements and observations seemed merely an extension of his medical practice. He told her that he was conducting a study on nutrition and growth, that by carefully controlling her diet and monitoring her physical development, he could contribute valuable data to the medical community. Abigail, trusting and obedient, agreed to participate, believing she was helping her father with important work. She did not question when he began restricting certain foods, replacing her normal meals with carefully measured portions of bland substances, recording her reactions and physical changes with meticulous detail. She did not protest when he insisted on examining her daily, checking her pulse and temperature, measuring the circumference of her limbs, documenting every aspect of her physical being in his growing collection of notebooks. As the weeks passed, the restrictions became more severe and the examinations more invasive. Dr. Blackwell had constructed a theory that certain physical traits could be enhanced or suppressed through environmental manipulation, that the body could be molded like clay if one understood the proper techniques. He began administering substances to Abigail, tonics and elixirs of his own creation, compounds mixed from chemicals ordered from suppliers in Louisville and Cincinnati. Some made her violently ill, causing her to spend days in bed, racked with fever and nausea. Others seemed to have no effect at all, leading her father to adjust dosages and combinations, always recording, always measuring, always pushing forward with his research. Abigail began to lose weight, her once healthy complexion turning pale and sallow, dark circles forming beneath her eyes. When she complained of pain or exhaustion, her father dismissed her concerns, insisting that temporary discomfort was a small price to pay for scientific advancement, that she should feel honored to contribute to such important work. The true nature of Dr. Blackwell's obsession became apparent when he began the physical modifications. He had read accounts from European physicians who claimed to have successfully altered bone structure through the application of pressure and constraint, medieval practices that had been used to shape the skulls of infants in certain cultures, techniques that he believed could be adapted and refined for his purposes. He constructed devices in his workshop, metal frames and leather straps, contraptions designed to apply constant force to specific parts of the body. He told Abigail that these apparatuses would correct certain imperfections in her posture and skeletal alignment, that wearing them for several hours each day would improve her health and appearance. The reality was far more sinister. The devices caused excruciating pain, leaving bruises and abrasions on her skin, forcing her bones and joints into unnatural positions. She begged him to remove them, tears streaming down her face. But he refused, insisting that she must endure, that greatness required sacrifice, that she would thank him when the results became apparent. By spring, Abigail had become a prisoner in her own home. Her father had dismissed the household staff, claiming that their presence interfered with his research, that confidentiality was essential for the integrity of his work. In truth, he could not risk anyone witnessing what he was doing to his daughter, could not allow outsiders to see the gaunt, trembling girl who now spent most of her time confined to a room on the second floor, a room he had converted into a makeshift laboratory. The windows were kept shuttered, the door locked from the outside, and Abigail was allowed out only for her daily examinations and the brief periods when her father needed to adjust his instruments or administer new treatments. She had stopped attending church, stopped receiving visitors, stopped existing in the eyes of the community. When concerned neighbors inquired about her absence, Dr. Blackwell explained that she had fallen ill with a delicate condition that required isolation and rest, that he was providing the best possible care, that she would recover in time. No one questioned the word of a respected physician. No one thought to look beyond his reassurances. No one imagined the horror unfolding behind those shuttered windows. What drives a man to commit such atrocities against his own flesh and blood? As this tale grows darker, consider what you would do if you suspected something terrible was happening behind closed doors. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story has gripped you, hit that like button so others can discover the truth we are uncovering together. The isolation and abuse continued through the summer months, with Dr. Blackwell's experiments growing ever more extreme. He had moved beyond simple dietary restrictions and physical constraints, now attempting surgical interventions, minor procedures performed without proper anesthesia, using his daughter's body as a testing ground for techniques he had only read about in medical journals. He convinced himself that he was on the verge of a breakthrough, that the data he was collecting would revolutionize the field of hereditary science, that future generations would hail him as a pioneer. In his twisted logic, Abigail's suffering was not cruelty but necessity, not torture but research, not a crime but a contribution to human knowledge. The line between physician and monster had been crossed so gradually that he no longer recognized it existed, and his daughter, weakened by months of abuse, had begun to lose hope that anyone would. The turning point came in August of 1876, when a traveling minister named Reverend Thomas Ashford arrived in Harrodsburg to conduct a series of revival meetings. Reverend Ashford was known throughout Kentucky for his passionate sermons and his commitment to social justice, having spent years advocating for the poor and speaking out against the exploitation of the vulnerable. During his stay in town, he made it his practice to visit the homes of prominent citizens, seeking donations for his charitable works and offering spiritual counsel to those in need. When he called upon the Blackwell residents, he was greeted by Dr. Blackwell himself, who seemed agitated and reluctant to invite the Reverend inside. The doctor explained that his daughter was unwell and could not receive visitors, that his household was in a state of disruption due to her illness, that perhaps the Reverend might return at a more convenient time. Something in the doctor's manner troubled Ashford, a nervousness that seemed out of proportion to the situation, a desperate quality in his eyes that suggested he was hiding something more serious than a sick child. Reverend Ashford did not leave immediately as the doctor had hoped. Instead, he engaged Dr. Blackwell in conversation, asking about the nature of Abigail's illness, expressing concern for her spiritual well-being, offering to pray for her recovery. As they spoke on the front porch, a sound drifted down from the second floor, a cry that was quickly muffled, a sound of distress that lasted only a moment, but was unmistakable in its anguish. Dr. Blackwell claimed it was merely the wind rattling the shutters, but Reverend Ashford knew the sound of human suffering when he heard it. He insisted on seeing Abigail, claiming it was his pastoral duty to minister to the sick, that he would not leave until he had offered her the comfort of prayer. The doctor refused, his agitation growing into anger, ordering the Reverend to leave his property immediately. Ashford departed, but he did not forget what he had heard, and he began making inquiries around town, asking when anyone had last seen Abigail Blackwell, gathering information that would paint a disturbing picture of isolation and secrecy. The Reverend's investigation revealed that no one had seen Abigail in nearly 6 months, that the household staff had been dismissed under mysterious circumstances, that Dr. Blackwell had become increasingly reclusive and strange in his behavior. Several of the doctor's medical colleagues mentioned his obsession with eugenics and hereditary research, his unsettling questions about human experimentation, his belief that scientific progress justified methods that others might consider unethical. Armed with this information, Reverend Ashford approached the local sheriff, a man named Daniel Cooper, and shared his concerns. Sheriff Cooper was initially reluctant to investigate a respected member of the community based on what seemed like circumstantial evidence and the word of an outsider. However, Ashford was persistent, arguing that the welfare of a young woman was at stake, that the law had a duty to ensure her safety, that turning a blind eye to potential abuse would make them complicit in whatever horrors might be occurring. Finally, the sheriff agreed to accompany the Reverend to the Blackwell residence and demand to see Abigail, to verify that she was indeed receiving proper care. When Sheriff Cooper and Reverend Ashford arrived at the Blackwell home on the morning of August 15th, they found the doctor in his study, surrounded by his notebooks and instruments. He was furious at the intrusion, accusing them of harassment and defamation, threatening to use his influence to have the sheriff removed from office. Cooper remained calm but firm, explaining that he had a legal obligation to investigate reports of potential harm. The doctor, Blackwell, could either cooperate voluntarily or face a formal warrant and a more public inquiry. Faced with this ultimatum, the doctor reluctantly agreed to allow them to see his daughter, but he insisted on being present during the visit, claiming that her condition was delicate and that any excitement might worsen her health. He led them up the stairs to the locked room, his hands trembling as he produced the key, his face pale and drawn. When the door swung open, the two men were confronted with a sight that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Abigail Blackwell lay on a narrow bed in the center of the room, her body emaciated and covered with bruises, her limbs twisted at unnatural angles from the devices that had been clamped to them for months. The air was thick with the smell of chemicals and decay, and the walls were lined with shelves holding jars of specimens and notebooks filled with her father's observations. She was conscious but barely responsive, her eyes hollow and distant, her voice reduced to a whisper. When she saw the strangers in the doorway, a flicker of hope crossed her face, and she tried to speak, to tell them what had been done to her. But her father moved quickly to her side, placing a hand over her mouth, insisting that she was delirious from fever and could not be trusted to give accurate information. Sheriff Cooper had seen enough. He ordered Dr. Blackwell to step away from the girl, and when the doctor refused, the sheriff physically removed him from the room, placing him under arrest for assault and unlawful imprisonment. Reverend Ashford stayed with Abigail, removing the terrible devices from her body, wrapping her in blankets, speaking words of comfort and assurance that her ordeal was finally over. The arrest of Dr. Cornelius Blackwell sent shockwaves through Harrodsburg and the surrounding counties. News of his crimes spread rapidly, carried by telegraph and newspaper, transforming the respected physician into a figure of public revulsion and fascination. The details that emerged during the initial investigation were horrifying beyond what anyone had imagined, revealing not just isolated incidents of abuse but a systematic campaign of torture disguised as scientific research. Sheriff Cooper and his deputies seized the contents of the doctor's study, confiscating dozens of notebooks filled with meticulous records of every experiment performed on Abigail, every measurement taken, every substance administered, every moment of her suffering documented with clinical detachment. The notebooks revealed a mind that had completely divorced itself from empathy and morality, a man who viewed his own daughter as nothing more than raw material for his theories, a specimen to be manipulated and observed without regard for her humanity or her pain. Abigail was immediately removed from the house and taken to the home of a local widow named Mrs. Catherine Hartwell, who volunteered to care for the traumatized young woman while she recovered from her ordeal. A physician from Louisville, Dr. Samuel Morrison, was brought in to assess her condition and provide treatment, as no one in Harrodsburg felt comfortable taking on the case given their previous association with Dr. Blackwell. Dr. Morrison's examination revealed extensive damage to Abigail's body, including malnutrition, chemical burns, fractured bones that had healed improperly, and signs of repeated surgical interventions performed without adequate skill or care. He estimated that it would take months, possibly years, for her to recover physically, and he expressed grave concerns about the psychological trauma she had endured. Abigail herself was initially unable to speak about what had happened, retreating into silence whenever anyone tried to question her, flinching at sudden movements, crying out in her sleep. Mrs. Hartwell proved to be a patient and compassionate caregiver, slowly earning the girl's trust, creating a safe environment where healing could begin. As Abigail's physical condition stabilized, the legal proceedings against her father moved forward. Dr. Blackwell was held in the county jail, denied bail due to the severity of the charges and concerns that he might flee or attempt to interfere with witnesses. The prosecutor, a young attorney named James Whitmore, faced a challenging task. While the physical evidence of abuse was overwhelming, The legal framework for prosecuting such crimes was still developing in the 1870s, and there were few precedents for a case involving a father's systematic torture of his own child under the guise of medical research. Whitmore knew that he would need Abigail's testimony to secure a conviction, that the jury would need to hear directly from her about what she had endured, but he also understood that forcing her to relive her trauma in a public courtroom might cause further harm. He approached Mrs. Hartwell and Reverend Ashford, asking for their help in preparing Abigail to testify, in giving her the strength and support she would need to face her father in court. The trial of Dr. Cornelius Blackwell began in October of 1876, drawing spectators from across the state and attracting the attention of newspapers as far away as New York and Chicago. The courtroom was packed each day, with people standing in the aisles and crowding around the windows, eager to witness the proceedings against the man who had become known in the press as the monster of Harrodsburg. The prosecution's case was methodical and damning, presenting the notebooks as evidence of premeditated and sustained abuse, calling medical experts to testify about the injuries Abigail had suffered, bringing forward neighbors and colleagues who described Dr. Blackwell's increasingly erratic behavior and his obsession with eugenics. The defense attorney, a man named Richard Caldwell, who had been appointed by the court when no one else would take the case, attempted to argue that his client had been acting in what he believed were his daughter's best interests, that his intentions had been noble even if his methods were misguided, that he was a man of science who had lost his way in grief rather than a deliberate torturer. The argument fell flat with the jury, who could see in the evidence presented a clear pattern of cruelty and control that went far beyond any reasonable definition of medical treatment. The moment everyone had been waiting for came on the fourth day of the trial, when Abigail Blackwell took the stand. She had gained some weight since her rescue, and the bruises had faded, but she still appeared fragile and haunted, her hands trembling as she placed them on the Bible to swear her oath. The courtroom fell silent as she began to speak, her voice soft but steady, describing in careful detail the progression of her father's experiments, the pain she had endured, the fear that had consumed her days and nights, the desperate hope that someone would discover what was happening and come to save her. She spoke of how her father had justified each new torment, how he had told her that her suffering had meaning and purpose, how he had promised that she would be remembered as a contributor to scientific progress. She described the moment when she realized that he would never stop, that he saw her not as his daughter but as an object to be studied, that her only hope of survival lay in someone from outside discovering the truth. As she testified, many in the courtroom wept openly, and even the judge had to pause the proceedings several times to compose himself. Dr. Blackwell sat motionless at the defense table, his face expressionless, showing no sign of remorse or recognition of the enormity of his crimes. The defense's cross-examination of Abigail was brief and ineffective. Richard Caldwell, clearly uncomfortable with his role, asked only a few perfunctory questions, attempting to establish that Dr. Blackwell had provided her with food and shelter, that he had not intended to cause permanent harm, that his actions stemmed from a misguided belief in scientific progress rather than malicious intent. Abigail answered each question with quiet dignity, refusing to minimize what had been done to her, making it clear that intentions meant nothing in the face of the reality of her suffering. When Caldwell suggested that she might have misunderstood her father's purposes, that her youth and lack of education might have led her to misinterpret legitimate medical procedures, she looked directly at the jury and stated that no amount of scientific justification could excuse torture, that she had understood perfectly well that what was being done to her was wrong, that she had begged him to stop and been ignored. The jury's expressions made it clear that they believed her completely, and Caldwell wisely chose to end his questioning rather than risk further damaging his client's already hopeless case. The prosecution called several additional witnesses to reinforce their case, including Dr. Samuel Morrison, who provided expert testimony about the nature and extent of Abigail's injuries, explaining to the jury in clear terms that the procedures performed on her had no legitimate medical purpose and could only be described as torture. He presented drawings and diagrams showing the devices that had been used on her, explaining how they worked and what effects they would have had on her body. making it impossible for anyone to claim ignorance about the suffering they caused. Reverend Ashford testified about his initial visit to the Blackwell home, the cry he had heard, the doctor's suspicious behavior, and the condition in which they had found Abigail when they finally gained entry to her room. Sheriff Cooper described the scene of the arrest and the contents of the study, reading selected passages from the notebooks that demonstrated Dr. Blackwell's complete lack of empathy and his view of his daughter as an experimental subject rather than a human being. Each piece of evidence built upon the last, creating an overwhelming picture of systematic abuse that left no room for doubt or sympathy. When it came time for the defense to present its case, Richard Caldwell faced an impossible task. He called character witnesses who testified that Dr. Blackwell had once been a respected member of the community, a skilled physician who had helped many people, a man who had seemed devoted to his family before his wife's death. He attempted to introduce evidence of the doctor's grief and isolation following Eleanor's passing, suggesting that his mental state had been compromised by loss and loneliness. He brought in a physician from Lexington who testified about the emerging field of eugenics, explaining that many respected scientists believed in the possibility of improving human heredity through selective breeding and environmental manipulation, trying to contextualize Dr. Blackwell's actions within a broader scientific movement. None of it mattered. The jury could see the difference between theoretical discussions of heredity and the practical reality of a father torturing his daughter, between academic interest in eugenics and the criminal abuse of a vulnerable young woman. The defense's attempts to portray Dr. Blackwell as a tragic figure who had lost his way only served to highlight the magnitude of his betrayal and the calculated nature of his crimes. Dr. Blackwell himself chose not to testify, a decision that surprised many observers, but was likely wise given his complete lack of remorse and his continued belief in the righteousness of his actions. His attorney feared that putting him on the stand would only give the prosecution an opportunity to expose the full extent of his delusions and his inability to recognize the humanity of his victim. Instead, Caldwell delivered a closing argument that focused on mercy rather than innocence, acknowledging that his client had committed terrible acts, but asking the jury to consider that he had been motivated by a desire to advance human knowledge rather than by sadistic pleasure, that he deserved punishment, but perhaps not the harshest penalty available under law. The prosecutor, James Whitmore, delivered a passionate rebuttal, arguing that Dr. Blackwell's education and position made his crimes even more heinous, that he had violated every oath he had taken as a physician and every duty he owed as a father, that the only appropriate response to such monstrous behavior was the full force of the law. He reminded the jury of Abigail's testimony, of the physical evidence, of the notebooks that revealed a mind utterly devoid of compassion, and he asked them to send a message that no amount of scientific ambition could justify the torture of an innocent person. Have you ever wondered how far someone might go in the name of progress? What would you have done if you were on that jury, faced with such overwhelming evidence of a father's betrayal? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you are as captivated by this dark chapter of history as we are, make sure you are subscribed to Mysteries Beneath the Veil, so you do not miss the conclusion of this harrowing tale. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with their verdict. The foreman stood and announced that they found Dr. Cornelius Blackwell guilty on all counts, including assault, unlawful imprisonment, and attempted murder. The courtroom erupted in applause and shouts of approval, with many spectators openly celebrating the conviction. The judge gavelled for order and scheduled sentencing for the following week, remanding Dr. Blackwell to custody until that time. As the doctor was led from the courtroom in chains, he finally showed some emotion, not remorse or shame, but anger and indignation, shouting that history would vindicate him, that future generations would understand the importance of his work, that he had been persecuted for daring to push the boundaries of human knowledge. His words only confirmed what everyone already knew, that he was a man completely divorced from moral reality, incapable of understanding the evil he had committed, a monster who would never acknowledge the suffering he had caused. The sentencing hearing took place on a cold morning in late October, with the same crowds that had filled the courtroom throughout the trial returning to witness the final chapter of the legal proceedings. Judge Harrison Pemberton, a stern man known for his fairness and his intolerance of cruelty, addressed the court before pronouncing sentence. He spoke at length about the nature of Dr. Blackwell's crimes, noting that they represented not just a violation of law, but a profound betrayal of the most fundamental human bonds: the trust between parent and child, the duty of the strong to protect the weak, the obligation of those with knowledge and power to use it for good rather than harm. He observed that Dr. Blackwell's education and professional standing made his crimes more rather than less serious, that society placed special trust in physicians and expected them to uphold the highest ethical standards, that the abuse of that trust warranted the severest punishment. He acknowledged the defense's arguments about the doctor's mental state and his grief over his wife's death, but he rejected the notion that these factors provided any meaningful mitigation for years of systematic torture. Judge Pemberton then turned his attention to the question of appropriate punishment. Under Kentucky law at the time, the crimes for which Dr. Blackwell had been convicted could carry sentences ranging from lengthy imprisonment to death, depending on the circumstances and the judge's discretion. The prosecutor had recommended the maximum penalty, arguing that the calculated and prolonged nature of the abuse, combined with the defendant's complete lack of remorse, warranted the harshest possible response. The defense had pleaded for leniency, suggesting that life imprisonment would be sufficient to protect society while acknowledging the possibility of eventual rehabilitation. Judge Pemberton considered both positions before announcing his decision. He sentenced Dr. Cornelius Blackwell to life imprisonment at hard labor in the Kentucky State Penitentiary, with no possibility of parole, noting that while he had considered the death penalty, he believed that forcing the doctor to live with the consequences of his actions for the remainder of his natural life would be a more fitting punishment than a quick execution. The courtroom again erupted in approval, and this time the judge allowed the applause to continue for several moments before restoring order. As Dr. Blackwell was led away to begin his sentence, attention turned to Abigail and her future. She had no other family to care for her, as her brothers had long since moved away and had shown no interest in returning to help their sister. Mrs. Catherine Hartwell, who had been caring for Abigail since her rescue, offered to continue serving as her guardian until she reached adulthood and could establish herself independently. The court approved this arrangement, and a trust was established using funds from the sale of Dr. Blackwell's property and medical practice to provide for Abigail's ongoing care and education. Reverend Ashford, who had become a strong advocate for the young woman, worked with community leaders to ensure that she would have the resources and support necessary to rebuild her life. The story of her courage in testifying against her father had made her something of a public figure, and many people expressed admiration for her strength and resilience in the face of unimaginable trauma. However, Abigail herself wanted nothing more than to retreat from public view, to heal in private, to find some measure of peace after the nightmare she had endured. The case of Dr. Cornelius Blackwell had implications that extended far beyond Harrodsburg and even beyond Kentucky. Newspapers across the country had covered the trial extensively, and the details of his crimes sparked a national conversation about medical ethics, parental authority, and the dangers of scientific obsession unchecked by moral constraints. Medical societies and universities began to discuss the need for formal ethical guidelines governing human experimentation, recognizing that the rapid advancement of scientific knowledge in the late 19th century created new opportunities for abuse, if not properly regulated. The emerging eugenics movement, which had been gaining respectability in academic circles, faced increased scrutiny and criticism, as people recognized the potential for such theories to be used to justify horrific acts. Some defenders of eugenics tried to distance the legitimate scientific study of heredity from Dr. Blackwell's crimes, arguing that he was an aberration who had perverted good ideas for evil purposes, but others began to question whether any philosophy that ranked human beings according to their supposed genetic worth could ever be truly ethical. The trial also raised important questions about the legal system's ability to protect vulnerable individuals from abuse within their own families. In the 1870s, the law generally granted fathers nearly absolute authority over their children, and intervention by the state in family matters was rare and controversial. The successful prosecution of Dr. Blackwell represented a significant step toward recognizing that parental authority had limits, that children had rights that deserved legal protection, that the state had an obligation to investigate and punish abuse even when it occurred within the private sphere of the home. Reformers and advocates for children's welfare pointed to the case as evidence of the need for stronger laws and more robust mechanisms for detecting and responding to domestic violence and child abuse. The case became a touchstone in debates about family law and social reform that would continue for decades, influencing the development of child protection systems and the gradual expansion of legal protections for vulnerable populations. Dr. Blackwell's crimes had exposed a dark truth about the potential for evil that could flourish behind closed doors, and society was beginning to grapple with its responsibility to prevent such horrors from occurring in the future. In the months following the trial, Abigail Blackwell began the long and difficult process of rebuilding her life. Under Mrs. Hartwell's care, she slowly regained her physical health, though some of the damage her father had inflicted would never fully heal. Her bones had been permanently weakened by the devices he had used, leaving her with chronic pain and limited mobility in certain joints. The chemical burns had left scars on her skin, and the malnutrition she had suffered during her captivity had affected her overall constitution in ways that would persist throughout her life. Dr. Morrison continued to visit regularly, providing ongoing medical treatment and monitoring her recovery, always gentle and respectful in his approach, working to help her overcome the fear and distrust of physicians that her father's abuse had instilled. The physical healing was challenging enough, but the psychological wounds proved even more difficult to address, as Abigail struggled with nightmares, anxiety, and periods of deep depression that would overwhelm her without warning. Mrs. Hartwell proved to be exactly the kind of caregiver Abigail needed, patient and understanding, never pushing her to talk about her experiences before she was ready, creating a stable and nurturing environment where healing could occur at its own pace. The widow had lost her own daughter to scarlet fever years earlier, and she poured into Abigail all the maternal love and care she had been unable to give to her own child. She encouraged Abigail to pursue activities that brought her joy, teaching her to garden and to bake, introducing her to needlework and painting, helping her discover interests and talents that had been suppressed during her ordeal. Reverend Ashford also remained involved in Abigail's life, visiting regularly to provide spiritual counsel and emotional support, helping her work through the complex feelings of anger, betrayal, and grief that accompanied her recovery. He never pressured her to forgive her father, recognizing that such forgiveness, if it ever came, would have to emerge from her own heart in her own time, and that demanding it prematurely would only add to her burden. As word of Abigail's story spread, she began receiving letters from people across the country, some offering sympathy and support, others sharing their own experiences of abuse and trauma, finding in her courage an inspiration for their own healing. She was initially overwhelmed by this attention, uncomfortable with being seen as a public figure or a symbol of survival, but gradually she came to appreciate the connections these letters represented, the sense that she was not alone in her suffering, that others understood what she had endured. Some of the letters came from women who had escaped abusive marriages or families, others from children who had suffered at the hands of parents or guardians, still others from people who had witnessed abuse and felt guilty for not intervening sooner. Abigail began to write back to some of these correspondents, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence, finding that helping others process their own trauma gave her a sense of purpose and meaning that aided in her own recovery. By the spring of 1877, Abigail had made enough progress that she began to consider what she wanted to do with her future. She had received a modest education before her father's abuse began, and she was intelligent and curious, eager to learn and grow despite the years that had been stolen from her. Mrs. Hartwell arranged for a tutor to work with her, helping her continue her education and prepare for whatever path she might choose. Abigail discovered a particular interest in literature and writing, finding solace in books and expressing herself through poetry and journal entries that helped her process her experiences. She also developed a passion for advocacy, wanting to use her story to help prevent others from suffering similar fates. to push for legal reforms that would better protect children from abuse, to challenge the social attitudes that allowed such crimes to remain hidden. She began speaking with local women's groups and reform organizations, sharing her story when she felt strong enough, lending her voice to causes aimed at protecting the vulnerable and holding abusers accountable. The question of what had become of Dr. Cornelius Blackwell himself was one that many people wondered about, but few dared to ask Abigail directly. He had been transported to the Kentucky State Penitentiary in Frankfort, where he was assigned to hard labor in the prison workshops. Reports from the prison indicated that he remained unrepentant, continuing to insist that his experiments had been justified and that history would vindicate his work. He attempted to continue his research even in prison, requesting access to medical journals and writing materials, petitioning the warden for permission to conduct studies on his fellow inmates. All such requests were denied, and he was kept under close supervision to prevent him from harming anyone else. He had no visitors, as his former colleagues and friends had all disowned him, and his sons refused to acknowledge his existence. He spent his days in isolation, both physical and social. A man who had destroyed his own life and his daughter's in pursuit of a twisted vision of scientific progress. Some reports suggested that he had begun to show signs of mental deterioration, talking to himself and exhibiting paranoid delusions, though whether this was genuine madness or a calculated attempt to secure a transfer to an asylum was unclear. Abigail herself never spoke of him, refusing to give him any space in her thoughts or her conversations, focusing instead on building a future that had nothing to do with the man who had once controlled every aspect of her existence. The impact of the Blackwell case continued to reverberate through American society long after the trial concluded. Medical schools began incorporating discussions of ethics into their curricula, recognizing that technical skill alone was insufficient preparation for the moral complexities physicians would face in their careers. The American Medical Association, which had been founded in 1847 but was still developing its professional standards, took up the question of human experimentation with new urgency, drafting guidelines that emphasized the need for informed consent and the protection of research subjects from harm. While these early efforts were far from perfect and would require decades of refinement, they represented an important acknowledgement that the medical profession needed to police itself and establish clear boundaries around acceptable conduct. The Blackwell case was frequently cited in these discussions as an example of what could happen when scientific ambition was allowed to override basic human decency and respect for individual autonomy. The eugenics movement, which had been gaining momentum in the 1870s and would reach its peak influence in the early 20th century, also faced increased scrutiny in the wake of the scandal. Critics pointed to Dr. Blackwell's crimes as evidence of the dangerous implications of eugenic thinking, arguing that any philosophy that treated human beings as specimens to be improved or eliminated based on their genetic characteristics inevitably led to dehumanization and abuse. Defenders of eugenics tried to maintain that the science itself was sound and that Dr. Blackwell had simply been a madman who misapplied legitimate principles, but the association between eugenic ideology and his horrific experiments proved difficult to shake. The case contributed to a growing skepticism about eugenic claims and methods, though it would take many more years and far greater atrocities before the movement would be thoroughly discredited. The seeds of doubt planted by the Blackwell scandal would eventually grow into a broader rejection of eugenic thinking, particularly after the world witnessed the ultimate expression of such ideas in the genocidal policies of Nazi Germany. Legal reforms aimed at protecting children from abuse also gained traction in the years following the trial. Several states, inspired by the Blackwell case and similar incidents, passed laws that expanded the circumstances under which the state could intervene in family matters to protect children from harm. These laws gave authorities greater power to investigate reports of abuse, to remove children from dangerous situations, and to prosecute parents and guardians who violated their duty of care. The reforms were controversial, with some critics arguing that they represented an unwarranted intrusion into family privacy and parental authority, but supporters pointed to cases like Abigail Blackwell's as proof that such interventions were necessary to prevent unspeakable suffering. The legal framework for child protection remained incomplete and inconsistent across jurisdictions, but the principle that children had rights deserving of legal protection had been established, and it would continue to develop throughout the late 19th and 20th centuries. Abigail herself continued to heal and grow, gradually transforming from a victim into a survivor and eventually into an advocate. By 1880, she had begun writing articles for reform-minded publications, sharing her story and calling for changes in law and social attitudes that would better protect vulnerable individuals from abuse. She wrote with clarity and power, her words carrying the weight of lived experience, and her articles were widely read and discussed. She became involved with the emerging women's rights movement, recognizing connections between her own experience of powerlessness and the broader legal and social subordination of women in American society. She argued that as long as women and children were treated as the property of husbands and fathers, rather than as autonomous individuals with their own rights, abuses like those she had suffered would continue to occur. Her advocacy work gave her a sense of purpose and helped her reclaim agency over her own narrative, transforming her from an object of pity into a voice for change. In 1883, Abigail married a kind and gentle man named William Preston, a schoolteacher she had met through her advocacy work. William had been moved by her courage and strength, and he approached her with respect and patience, never pressuring her, always allowing her to set the pace of their relationship. Their courtship was long and careful, as Abigail needed time to learn to trust again, to believe that not all men were like her father, that love did not have to mean control and suffering. William proved himself worthy of her trust, supporting her work, encouraging her writing, and creating a partnership based on mutual respect and affection. They settled in Louisville, where Abigail continued her advocacy and William taught at a local school. They never had children, a decision Abigail made after careful consideration, fearing that the physical damage her father had inflicted might make pregnancy dangerous, and also uncertain whether she could bear the vulnerability that comes with bringing a child into the world. William supported her decision without question, and they built a life together that was quiet and peaceful, a stark contrast to the horror of her youth. Dr. Cornelius Blackwell died in prison in 1889, 13 years after his conviction, having never expressed remorse for his crimes or acknowledged the suffering he had caused his daughter. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, though some reports suggested he had simply lost the will to live after years of isolation and the complete collapse of his reputation and legacy. He was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery, with no mourners and no ceremony, his passing noted only in brief newspaper articles that recounted his crimes and his conviction. Abigail learned of his death through a letter from the prison warden, who felt obligated to inform her as his only surviving family member. She read the letter once, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer never to be looked at again. She felt no grief at his passing, but also no satisfaction or sense of closure. He had been dead to her for years, ever since the moment she realized that the man she had called father had ceased to exist, replaced by a monster who saw her only as an experiment. His physical death changed nothing about her life or her healing, and she refused to give him any more of her emotional energy than he had already stolen. The house in Harrodsburg where the abuse had occurred was eventually torn down, as no one wanted to live in a place associated with such horror. The land was sold and a new building erected, and over time the physical traces of Dr. Blackwell's crimes were erased from the landscape. However, the memory of what had happened there persisted in the community, passed down through generations as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of paying attention when something seems wrong. The case became part of local folklore, with details sometimes exaggerated or distorted in the retelling, but the core truth remained that a respected man had committed unspeakable acts against his own daughter, and that only the courage of those who refused to look away had brought his crimes to light. The story served as a reminder that evil could hide behind respectability, that suffering could occur in plain sight if people chose not to see it, that speaking up and taking action were moral imperatives even when doing so was difficult or uncomfortable. Abigail continued her advocacy work throughout her life, becoming a respected voice in movements for child protection, women's rights, and medical ethics reform. She published a memoir in 1895 titled Surviving the Unthinkable, which provided a detailed account of her experiences and her journey toward healing. The book was both praised for its honesty and criticized by some as too disturbing for public consumption, but it sold widely and influenced public opinion on issues of abuse and family violence. Abigail donated the proceeds from the book to organizations working to protect children and support survivors of trauma, continuing her commitment to turning her suffering into something that could help others. She corresponded with reformers and activists across the country, offering advice and support, sharing strategies for advocacy, and building networks of people committed to social change. Her work contributed to the gradual shift in American attitudes toward child welfare and the responsibilities of the state to protect vulnerable individuals. In her later years, Abigail found peace in the quiet life she had built with William. They traveled when her health permitted, visiting places she had only read about in books, experiencing the world beyond the confines of the room where she had once been imprisoned. She continued to write, producing essays and articles on various social issues, always bringing her unique perspective as someone who had survived extreme abuse and rebuilt her life. She maintained correspondence with many of the people who had helped her, including Mrs. Hartwell, who remained a beloved figure in her life until the widow's death in 1901, and Reverend Ashford, who had moved to another parish but never forgot the young woman whose rescue had been one of the defining moments of his ministry. Abigail also mentored younger women who had experienced trauma, offering them the same kind of support and understanding that had been so crucial to her own recovery, creating a legacy of compassion and resilience that extended far beyond her own story. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Abigail watched as many of the reforms she had advocated for began to take hold. Child protection laws became more comprehensive and more consistently enforced. Medical ethics received greater attention in professional training and practice. The eugenics movement, while still influential, faced growing criticism and opposition. Women gained more legal rights and social autonomy, though full equality remained a distant goal. Abigail knew that her own suffering had played a small part in these larger changes, that by refusing to remain silent, by insisting that her story be heard and her pain be acknowledged, she had contributed to a broader awakening about the realities of abuse and the need for systemic change. She took quiet satisfaction in this knowledge, not seeking fame or recognition, but simply wanting to know that her ordeal had not been meaningless, that something good had come from something terrible, that other children might be spared similar fates because people had learned from what had happened to her. Abigail Blackwell Preston died peacefully in her sleep in 1924 at the age of 64, surrounded by the love and respect of those who knew her. Her husband William, who survived her by only 2 years, described her as the strongest and most compassionate person he had ever known, someone who had taken the worst that life could offer and transformed it into a force for good in the world. Her funeral was attended by dozens of people whose lives she had touched through her advocacy work, her writing, and her personal kindness. Speakers at the service spoke of her courage, her resilience, and her unwavering commitment to protecting others from the kind of suffering she had endured. They remembered her not primarily as a victim of her father's crimes, though that was an inescapable part of her story, but as a woman who had refused to be defined by her trauma, who had built a meaningful life despite the obstacles she faced, who had used her voice to make the world a better place. The legacy of the Blackwell case extends far beyond the individuals directly involved. It stands as a stark reminder of the potential for abuse when power is unchecked and when scientific or intellectual pursuits are divorced from ethical considerations and basic human empathy. The case helped establish important precedents in medical ethics, child protection law, and the legal recognition of abuse within families. It contributed to broader social conversations about authority, autonomy, and the responsibilities of communities to protect their most vulnerable members. The story has been studied by historians, ethicists, and legal scholars as an example of how individual crimes can catalyze systemic change, how personal courage can inspire collective action, and how societies can learn from their failures to prevent future atrocities. The case also serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of ideologies that rank human worth or that treat people as means to ends rather than as ends in themselves. Lessons that remain relevant in contemporary debates about bioethics, human rights, and social justice. For those who study the history of child abuse and family violence, the Blackwell case represents an important milestone in the long struggle to recognize and address these issues. Before cases like this one brought the reality of domestic abuse into public consciousness, such crimes were often ignored or minimized, treated as private family matters beyond the reach of law or social intervention. The successful prosecution of Dr. Blackwell and the public outrage his crimes generated helped shift attitudes, making it more difficult for abusers to hide behind closed doors and more likely that victims would be believed and supported when they came forward. The case demonstrated that no amount of social respectability or professional standing should shield someone from accountability for abuse, that the law must protect the vulnerable even when doing so requires challenging traditional notions of parental authority and family privacy. These principles, which seem obvious today, were far from settled in the 1870s, and cases like the Blackwell trial played a crucial role in establishing them. The story of Abigail Blackwell also offers a powerful testament to the human capacity for resilience and recovery. Despite enduring years of systematic torture at the hands of the person who should have been her greatest protector, despite suffering physical and psychological damage that would affect her for the rest of her life, Abigail not only survived but thrived, building a life of purpose and meaning, forming loving relationships, and contributing to positive social change. Her story reminds us that trauma, while it leaves lasting marks, does not have to define a person's entire existence, that healing is possible even from the most severe wounds, and that survivors can reclaim their agency and their voices. It also highlights the crucial importance of support systems in the recovery process, the role that compassionate caregivers like Mrs. Hartwell, advocates like Reverend Ashford, and loving partners like William Preston play in helping survivors rebuild their lives. No one heals in isolation, and Abigail's recovery was made possible by the network of people who believed in her, supported her, and gave her the space and resources she needed to find her way forward. What can we learn from this dark chapter of history as we navigate our own time? The Blackwell case challenges us to remain vigilant against abuse in all its forms, to question authority when it is exercised without accountability, to speak up when we suspect that someone is being harmed, and to create systems and structures that protect the vulnerable rather than enabling their exploitation. It reminds us that progress, whether scientific, social, or otherwise, must always be grounded in respect for human dignity and rights, that the ends never justify means that involve the suffering of innocent people, and that we have collective responsibilities to one another that transcend individual ambitions or desires. As you reflect on this story, consider how you might apply these lessons in your own life and community. If you found this investigation into one of history's most disturbing cases compelling, subscribe to Mysteries Beneath the Veil, where we continue to uncover the hidden truths that shape our understanding of human nature and society. Share this story with others who appreciate deep dives into historical mysteries. Leave a comment with your thoughts on how we can better protect vulnerable individuals today, and join us as we explore more of the secrets that lie beneath the surface of respectable society. Thank you for accompanying us on this difficult but important journey into the past, and remember that by learning from history's darkest moments, we can work together to create a future where such horrors are no longer possible.